All right, I think we're officially underway. Hey everybody, I'm Sean Gibbons. I'm the Executive Director of the Communications Network. And we're doing a couple new things today, I should probably say at the outset. Number one, if you want to watch Bruce and I, we're sitting in a conference room. The good folks at Burness Communications were kind enough to make the space available, since Washington, D.C. is apparently a traffic nightmare at the moment with the inauguration looming. But you can see us on Facebook Live right now, Com Network. It's Facebook.com/the Com Network, and yes, I know I need a haircut. You can also follow us on Twitter. The hashtag we're going to be using, you can ask questions there, is hashtag COM, COMNETLIVE. And what we're also going to be doing, this is also new for us, is the format of this particular hour, this session where we're going to talk about character, is really meant to be a conversation. So oftentimes, if you've joined us in the past for a webinar, you'll know that typically I cede the floor at some point and we have a presenter or presenters make the case or share a new strategy, new idea, emerging trend, that sort of thing. In this case, this comes from, and this is where I get to introduce my colleague for the next hour. This comes from a conversation that I was having with an old dear friend and if I don't embarrass you too much, a mentor, and what is one of my favorite people. Bruce Weindruch. Bruce is, by training, a historian and an author, and runs an organization called the History Factory. It has a very curious mission. They sit down with mostly Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies. He works with the CEOs and leadership teams to really think about leveraging an organization's history to help it, you guys' tagline is sort of start with the future and work back.
That's it.
And so Bruce and I were chatting a couple of weeks ago about the world that is about to be. The world is changing from a policy and political framework. And I was remarking that I had noticed a lot of organizations in the sector had started to raise their voices. Folks who come to mind immediately are folks like Darren Walker from the Ford Foundation, or Grant Oliphant from the Heinz Endowments, Anne-Marie Slaughter from New America, and a number of other folks have raised their voices, and most of them have done a very simple thing. They've expressed their values, their personal values and the values that their organizations represent or work towards, and have reaffirmed their mission. Seems like a very simple thing, but a pretty powerful thing. And so Bruce said, yeah, you know what you're talking about. It's character. And so we started to have this really interesting conversation. And I think I stopped you after like this, my second or third question. And Bruce is one of those guys I go to when I want to try to understand the world. And of course, he was giving these really fascinating answers. Like, whoa, wait a minute. I'd love to continue this, but could I bring a few friends? So that's what you guys are. For the next hour or so, we're all just going to have a chance to sort of tap into Bruce and his wisdom and experience and ask a few questions of him. But I'm going to take the privilege of trying to sort of frame the conversation. So if you are not watching this on Facebook, or if you are and you're also in the webinar, if you'll see the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you should see it says the word chat, and there's a little box there where you can type a question in. Go ahead and type your questions in. They can be broad, they can be very, very focused and particular to your organization. We're going to try to get to as many as we possibly can. As has always been our habit, we are recording this session and we'll make it available in the next few days for you to have a look at or share with your colleagues. What we're going to be doing today, and what we hope to do today, is talk about a few things. One, why character matters, why it's such an important thing, and why it's actually a strategic asset for any organization, particularly for folks leading organizations in the communications job or in leadership roles. We're going to talk a little bit about, might feel to some extent like we're in uncharted waters, and I think to some extent we are. But we're also going to talk about some historical precedents for polarized and uncertain times, both here in the United States and abroad. We are in a moment of global polarization or global populism. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit about character in action. What's it actually look like? And then we're going to try to make this somewhat practical and pragmatic by talking a little bit about how you and your organization can use character to navigate this new and uncertain landscape that we're in. And of course, along the way, we're going to take your questions, but we're going to try to help you map out your own organization's character and how to deploy it. So sort of think of this in some ways as kissing cousin of sorts of crisis communications, thinking about your character and how to leverage it and guide you. Does that sound about right, Bruce?
Sounds right to me, Sean. Thanks.
All right. Great. So let's get underway. I'm going to start with a pretty obvious question here, the one that I think I started with you on the phone back when we were chatting, is, as a historian, do you see any precedents here for what we're currently experiencing? There's a tremendous amount of anxiety, I think, across the country. Fully, 64% of the country has expressed some reservations about this new administration as they're coming in, which is a historic low. I think the president-elect's approval ratings are below 40%, I think 36, 37% right now, which would suggest there's not much of a political mandate, and yet a big agenda seems to be about to arrive in Washington. A number of executive orders planned for Monday of next week. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about where we've seen this before. Historical precedents, socially, politically, culturally, here in the United States, and then more broadly around the world.
Yeah, Sean, it's interesting. Trained as a historian, I can't pick up the paper any day without feeling like one of those people that sees a car crash before it's about to happen. No, not again, not again. In reality, I'm a subscriber to the classic Mark Twain line, and it was Twain, rather than the past is prologue, it was Twain that said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. And so I think in answer to your question, and when we talked about this, I'm always listening for rhymes. There's never a one-to-one correlation. I wish there was. It'd make it a lot easier, because then history would be like math. We could just add it up. It's why my kids who are more science-oriented get very frustrated with history, because there is no formula. So let's talk a little bit about the rhymes. And I would argue, even in the search of character, don't try to look for a one-to-one. Just try to listen for the rhymes. So let me give you one that we're hearing a lot. And this is not mine. We're hearing a lot of the story that, gee, this is very much reminiscent of Nazi Germany. As a historian, you got to be, not only as a historian, as anyone, you have to be careful, obviously, not to make those comparisons. But the one rhyme that's kind of interesting to me as a historian is to look at the primary sources of the people at that time as they were trying to grapple with what became Hitler and the Nazi experience. And it's interesting, because what you get, that I find the rhyme, is we got to give this guy a chance. And this is sometimes coming from the Jewish community of Germany. We got to give this guy a chance. Maybe he's not going to be as bad as we think he's going to be. So I think that
You're making me nervous here, my friend.
Well, we're seeing it. You saw it in the press. You saw it in the leadership. So the one rhyme that I take from it is for those of us who perhaps, then you get a guy like Blow at the New York Times who says, I'm just not going to accept this. I am going to be the critic in-house every day.
Charles Blow.
Yeah, Charles Blow. Every day. So the one rhyme, I think, to try to compare this to the economics of the 1920s and 30s, partitioning of Europe, there's no comparison. And even to Trump, for goodness sake, the man's son-in-law is an Orthodox Jew. So I mean, that is a silly comparison. But I think in terms of the way that the accommodation, that's something to think about. All right.
Okay.
Here's another rhyme. Everyone keeps talking about Brexit. I was in London the morning that Trump was elected, and finally, for the first time, I understood Brexit.
So wait a minute. Did you vote?
I voted absentee.
Okay.
So
just making sure.
No, I did. But
you live in Washington, D.C.
I do. So yeah, there we go. So there you go. I never fully understood Brexit. Now the past is prologue. One might say, oh, see, this is just like Brexit. It's a anti-immigrant, nationalistic movement. But you know what I learned about Brexit the day in London? You know what Brexit meant to the Brits? Waking up in the morning and being totally shocked. They said, see, now you understand what Brexit was. To most Brits, Brexit was just waking up in the morning and being shocked, as we were here. Mm-hmm. That's the rhyme. Let's move forward. I hear this comparison to Berlusconi.
This is Silvio Berlusconi.
Right.
For many years, the
strong man in Italy.
Yeah.
So what do you have here? You've got a wealthy, a billionaire, media mogul who likes women.
This is Berlusconi we're talking about.
Right. Yes,
okay.
Correct. You picked up on the rhyme. I think it's the direct comparison isn't so much. Here's what I like. The rhyme I like is William Randolph Hearst. And I'll tell you why.
William Randolph Hearst, also a media magnate, but here in the United States, and Mr. Rosebud, for those of you who are film buffs.
Okay, so William Randolph Hearst, son of a wealthy, actually coal mining, silver mining fortune, New Yorker, media, also had issues with women. But here was the difference with the rhyme that I think is most interesting about Hearst. Hearst had a couple of runs as a congressman, but then
he did not win.
Congress he won. He did not win. He did not win
the
governorship. He did not win the presidency. The issue here about that I would say about him would be that there was a reason why he didn't win. The lesson here, the rhyme here is there were great candidates who ran against him. I mean, he ran against Charles Evans Hughes, who became a Supreme Court justice, was governor of New York. He ran against kind of as a progressive against Woodrow Wilson. The fact, the rhyme here is, if we look at history, had there been perhaps a better candidate
this cycle,
we might have had the same story with Trump that we had here. So that's a rhyme. The other thing I point out is, I think what's most interesting from a historical standpoint is the relationship to media. You had Teddy Roosevelt. He was the bully pulpit. He used the newspaper, the progressive movement, progressive newspaper, the growth of William Randolph Hearst, national newspapers. That was his vehicle, very much like Trump is using Twitter. Let's move to the next fella. Here's a rhyme. Here's a fellow who used radio, all right, in uncertain times. Masterful use of radio in his time. And then we go forward to another rhyme. JFK used television. So I think one of the important rhymes that we're living with is just the use of the communications technology. Mm-hmm. Okay? But as you read this morning, 69% of Americans wished he'd stop tweeting. Okay? Which is kind of an interesting point. So as we look at the rhymes, I guess the point I'm trying to say is, don't look for a linear.
This is just like
right.
pre-war Germany.
It's not.
Okay.
It's not. Okay? That's my answer to that question.
So, all right, that brings me to my next question, which everybody can see up here on the screen. Let's talk about a few examples of times of uncertainty here in the United States and around the globe, when individuals, and in many cases organizations, really leaned forward by emphasizing their character, that was their North Star, that was their guiding principle.
Yeah.
And as it's phrased here, how has character been elevated, tested, and proved?
Yeah.
Now, just before we even get into sort of the answer, so when we were chatting on the phone, one of the things that I said as I was reflecting on what Darren Walker has done, what Grant Oliphant, what Anne-Marie Slaughter, Sandra Fernandez, and a number of others have done, was that they were expressing values. And you immediately said, oh, wait a minute, there's a level above that. They're actually talking about character.
Right.
So let's, and what was interesting to me was you were having those very same conversations with a lot of the CEOs that you're talking to in the Fortune 100, the Fortune 50.
Yep.
Before we even get into we're going to put up a picture here of Abraham Lincoln just for fun, but before we even get into that, talk to me about what you've been hearing, because obviously folks in the social sector, folks who work for foundations and nonprofits, aren't alone in trying to make sense of this moment, and yet folks in the for-profit space, some of the larger for-profit companies here in the United States and around the globe, are really zeroing in on this idea of character.
Yep.
Let's talk about that.
All right, and this is why I picked this quote. You had asked the question about a time of uncertainty where character rose to the fore, and then we have a quote from probably one of the greatest examples of that. But you notice his differentiator here. Character is like a tree. Mm-hmm. Reputation is like the shadow. Okay? What we think of is typically the shadow, but it's the tree is the real thing. What are and what I would suggest to our listeners, and what I suggest to my clients, is don't mix up reputation with character. That's a real key differentiator. Character is, and what Lincoln means by the tree, I mean, that is the basis for who you are, okay? And by the way, if that tree is firmly rooted, and if you're very conscious of that tree, your reputation, your shadow, will become the exception.
Will reflect that. Yeah.
Okay. So when we talk about character, we're talking about the basis. And to your point about Oliphant and your point about Darren Walker, if you look at how they're talking, they're going back to a basic, I would argue, founding set of characteristics that by staying true to them, okay, is giving them security, it's giving them confidence, is giving them, in a sense, the ability to move forward. Lincoln is a great example in that he was known as a man of character well before he was the president. You read descriptions of him of a young lawyer, you read descriptions of him as a young man. He was a man of unbelievable character. What's interesting about that is that character became the nation's character in a time of probably unprecedented challenge and change, and it came from him. He projected it in his speeches, he projected it in his decision making. It was a great example of how he had the self-knowledge and the confidence of his character to be able to do what he did, and probably one of the most important times in the history of the company, history of the country. So there's a case of character from within, project out. Let's go to the next guy. Here's a guy, Winston Churchill, who has been pretty much described as having a very flawed character.
I've heard a few stories.
Okay, but the country's character, the world's character, became his character. And he became a champion of that. And I mean, this quote, these are not the dark days, these are the great days. These are the greatest days. He's going on and on and on. October 1941. It was in the midst of the Blitzkrieg. It was in the darkest period.
Before U.S. enters the war.
And here months before the U.S. enters the war. And where is he speaking this at? He's speaking at Harrow, the school he had gone to, which had been part of his not only character building experience, he kind of had to leave there because he had yet to develop his own character. But here's a case where, as you look as an organization at your organization's character, your constituency's character, your nation's character, and I would even argue to the practitioners, to your own personal character, it doesn't have to be necessarily an extension of yours, but it can become yours. And I think that's a very important point about Churchill. Let's move on a little bit. Here's a great challenge of character that so often you'll hear described when politicians of a generation, this was during Watergate, and this was a huge, Elliot Richardson resigned. It was a Saturday Night Massacre. Cox had been discharged as a special prosecutor. Richardson resigns, Ruckelshaus resigns, and a whole group of young, idealistic people resign. This is where character mattered. They did this long before it all fell apart. They acted on their particular beliefs as to what was fair, what was right for the nation, what was right for them, and they resigned. There was a generation of politicians, a generation of public servants who still to this day talk about that act as being a defining moment. That was an act of character. Okay.
And it was a Saturday Night Massacre?
Yeah, it was called the Saturday Night Massacre.
Right.
Very, very critical. Let's move forward. Here's a great example. Johnson & Johnson's response to the Tylenol scare.
Let's just put this in context because I know Tristan and Maggie, if you're watching on Facebook Live, you can't see them, but they're right off camera. And my guess is neither of you were born when this happened. I remember this.
Do you know the Tylenol scare, guys? This was a malicious
1980?
Criminal 82.
82, okay.
Criminal, malicious, tampered Tylenol. That's why it's such a pain to open up a bottle these days, guys.
Yeah, you used to be able to go to the store and buy
open up the bottle.
like a bottle of Tylenol. There was like a little cotton in it, and then there were the pills.
Right.
And someone poisoned them.
They poisoned them. And people. Johnson & Johnson has a very well-defined credo. They've always had it, and it was their compass north. It was their corporate character. They responded on character, and it was absolutely the right thing to do, and it's still held up today as the right thing to do. So there's a case in the midst of a lot of unknown where the corporate character was the
institutional character.
Institutional character was the right thing to do.
And what did they do? Just to be clear,
they pulled it off the shelves. I mean, immediately pulled it off the shelves. Right. Immediately.
So we're talking millions and millions and millions of bottles.
This was not about
almost overnight.
This was not about corporate shareholders. This was not about dollars and cents. This was about this is the right thing to do because our credo is to take care of those people that we take care of, and it still drives the company today. It's truly one of those remarkable stories to have an institution that has such a well-defined credo. We're going to talk later about having your character shelf ready.
Mm-hmm.
It was shelf ready. This is a crisis management case study in the early days of crisis management, but it proved to be the right thing because they had it ready to go. They knew how to respond, and it was reflexive. It was part of how they are. And then, I kind of joke with you, you talk about character in popular culture. There are those individuals. If you ever want to channel your inner character, it's the easiest thing to do. Just watch a Jimmy Stewart movie. This is a guy who made his reputation always being the individual whose character was questioned. I mean, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and It's a Wonderful Life. I mean, you sit there and you ache for the poor guy, right? Because he stays true to what he believes in the face of all the wrong things. But character matters. I showed the example of course, Tom Hanks. In more ways than one, has really made his reputation in kind of channeling that same guy. If you would, whether it was Sully, whether it was the captain on the hijacked ship, he always defaults to the guy with character. If you look at the books that he buys the rights to and then makes into movies, they're always about the individual who sticks to it, even though everyone thinks they're wrong, but they stay with it and they get through it. There's a popular culture example of character counts.
All right, so now here's the question where we've gone back in time a little bit, and now we get to sort of look forward just a couple of days, right? Maybe looking out into the next few months. What insight can we glean from what we've just heard? Whether it's Lincoln or Churchill or even Jimmy Stewart, about how we are and how we ought to be as we walk into the next few months and number of years.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, Sean. Fortunately, historians don't make the same mistakes that economists have made. We don't predict very often, but and there's a reason for that. I mean, I have here as an example Gibbon, no relation to you, Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Now let's put this in perspective. It's a 6-volume, 1,000-year sweep of history.
Mm-hmm.
It ends in the 1500s. He writes it 200 years later. So now he's got the perspective of 200 years, and it takes him 20 years to write it. So if you do all that math, that's how we used to have the luxury of gaining perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? We had 1,000 years, we had 20 years to look at it, another 200 years to look at it, and we had 22 years to write it. All right. Take a look at the timeline of kind of civilization. And what you see is...
And that's what we're looking at here.
That's what we're looking at here. Look at how simple it is on the left-hand side, and look at how complicated it gets at the end. The historical perspective as to how did we get ourselves here is, I think the answer is the historical perspective. I think in many ways we've gotten ourselves into a situation where historical perspective is very difficult to discern for many people. We no longer have the luxury of just stopping for a second and putting it in context. And as we talk a little bit later, how people are pivoting toward character, in a sense, they are using their historical perspective to do that.
And yet it's happening at this moment where we have these sort of, we live in a 24-hour news cycle, right? I mean, you're seeing it in this chart, but for folks who haven't seen this chart before, very briefly, and I know it's going to be kind of hard to see for some folks on the screen, just explain what it is you're seeing from left to right.
Well, I mean, what you're basically seeing are civilizations emerging around the world. You are seeing their populations growing. You are seeing major events happening at an increased pace. It's basically what you're seeing is the acceleration of civilization. And so it's that acceleration, and then, as to your point, as the next slide will show, the proliferation of communications that I'm suggesting has gotten us to the situation where we are, which is when one talks about fake news, when one talks about the ability to literally ignore something that one said the week before, this is a lack of historical perspective, okay? And so this is a major issue in terms of context and in terms of character, because one has to be able to understand this. We started our discussion when I said to you, trying to think about moving forward in times of uncertainty without, and I used the Borston quote, trying to plan for the future without having an understanding of the history, the historical context, is like trying to plant flowers. They'll blow right over. And right now, so much of what is out there is literally can be blown over immediately because it doesn't have the roots. It's what BuzzFeed is facing right now. It's what CNN is facing right now. It's what Trump is taking advantage of. It's what fake news comes from. It's not having the credibility, not having the historical context, not having the historical proof that indeed what we're dealing with is not true. So historical context, historical perspective on how we got ourselves into it, I'm arguing is lack of historical perspective. Now, move forward a bit.
Okay, before we do, actually, I want to just, because I do want to make sure that we really make this conversation include other folks. Lori writes in a question, and it's a good one and fair, so let's talk about it. If possible, I'd like to hear some examples of people who aren't white men. Now, there's lots of fantastic women and people of color who often don't get as much spotlight, but who are some of those who've shown particularly strong character that you've seen that you could point to just off the top of your head? I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but obviously it ain't all white dudes.
Well, no. And I mean, come on, we can go Joan of Arc. I mean, how far back do we want to go? How far back to Sojourner Truth? Harriet Tubman. So no. Yes, it's unfortunate that the choices I chose were telegraphed, but no. We have many examples of women in character in both the institutional setting, as well as I would argue that probably some of the greatest advances in corporate social responsibility have come from women of character. I would argue that Eleanor Roosevelt, Mother Teresa. I mean, we can go all day long.
Right. And Lori, just to give you more recent ones, if you're interested, you've not seen them. Dr. Sandra Hernandez, who leads the California Healthcare Foundation, Anne Marie Slaughter, who leads New America, both have written very thoughtful, measured, really extraordinary pieces in the wake of the election results. That I would point to and say those are just wonderful examples of leadership and of personal character and of representing your organization with great integrity.
But to Lori's point, I would argue, like the same argument is when a woman is in a leadership authority role, there are male tendencies that one tries to ascribe. Oh, well, they're being very masculine. They're being real bossy. Character has some of that too. It's interesting. The default with character is very similar that it is with men that it is with women, in that you have to think a little bit beyond it. We tend to think of Mount Rushmore, right? That's just the default, and you got me on that one, by the way.
So thank you, Laura. You got Bruce. It's always fun to hear.
But we talk a little bit about.
Well, here's some women.
Well, this is a historical perspective issue, and this is the rhyme that I'm hearing right now, and this is how our conversation got started. For the first time in a long, long time, I am seeing, particularly in a lot of the leadership of the organizations I work with, many are individuals who are in they're getting toward retirement. They're in their late 50s, early 60s. They were raised in a time when meaning and purpose was very, very important. It was the social uncertainty of the mid to late 1960s.
Oh, we're going to talk about the millennials here, aren't we?
Well, that was my point. For the first time, I am seeing alignment in my organizations between the cohort that's getting ready to leave.
These are the leaders.
And the cohort that is coming in. And they all are looking for one thing, purpose and meaning. Purpose and meaning. And why I bring this up is character is obviously the ultimate destination when one is looking for purpose and meaning. And it's a phenomenon. I don't know if your organizations are seeing it themselves, but the first thing, and we'll talk about it, how one takes that impetus and how it's articulated in terms of actual tactics and strategy. But more and more of my organizations are shifting, and this isn't just expedient. The leadership believes it, mm-hmm. and the people who join the company want to believe it. That where they're working has. I've seen in my 38 years of business, for instance, safety. Safety is an initiative in corporations. Safety used to be in terms of how many lost man hours, how much lost work. I talked to a CEO today, and they say, I can't go home at the end of the day and know that even one of our people I'd have to call their wife or the spouse, the husband, to say that we've lost someone. And that's the difference between what's happening today and I think what happened 15, 20 years ago. Big shift.
Right. And the thing, and just to really crystallize this, one of the things that you talked about when we were chatting privately before we decided to share this conversation with everybody was that CEOs now have a heck of a lot in common with the person who just walked in, right? Who's a couple of years out of school. The things that really motivate them and move them are aligned around this idea of character. Millennials, we hear a lot about this. They need purpose. They want to know the why behind every assignment. It better be a good answer, by the way. And then a lot of CEOs, when you reach that leadership position, as Sandra has, as Anne-Marie has, as Darren has, and others, that their belief is that ultimately it is about purpose, it is about character, it is about doing good.
And I think it is a powerful thing for the organization, and most importantly, it's a powerful thing for their constituencies, because it creates an alignment. And now it brings us back to kind of where we are today. I was looking for just the best example of a time of uncertainty when character and meaning and purpose. And Viktor Frankl, Austrian Jew, psychiatrist, lives through the Holocaust and then devotes his whole life to kind of in search of meaning. What is meaning? And this is a great quote. Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose. If you had to think about times of uncertainty and the circumstances that surround us, and is it really, how unbearable is this? And there are a lot of people who feel life is very unbearable right now.
There's only a tremendous amount of anxiety. I don't think we can understate that.
Well, let's bring it back to what Frankl says, but only by lack of meaning and purpose. And that's why I think that this whole shift toward character is in a sense happening. Is the times of uncertainty are causing people to look for this to make their life meaningful and purposeful.
All right, guys, send your questions in. We will get to them, I promise. We just talked about this a little bit, but let's dig in a little bit. Let's talk about this idea that a lot of the for-profit companies that you're working with around the globe are pivoting towards character as they look to provide a sense of meaning and purpose for their workforce, the people they work for, people they serve, and more broadly, the general public. Well, let's talk about how that actually gets reflected in real-world terms. This is where we're going to pivot, guys. We're going to start talking practical. Like, what does this mean for your organization? So this is an appropriate place. If you have a question that's particular to the place where you're working or the place that you're leading, please send it in. But let's talk about how character ultimately shows up in terms of strategy and short-term tactics.
Yeah.
How is it a strategic asset that you can actually leverage? And I don't mean that in any flip sense. I mean that as really as a core way to orient yourself and work in the world.
Yep. All right.
And so is this where I get to show you the Coca-Cola bottle?
Yeah. Let's start with
that.
Let's start with a pretty straightforward example. And I always try to point out it's the difference between Coke and Pepsi. And look, I will acknowledge neither of them are my client. So I've got no skin in the Coke or Pepsi game. I know their history equally well. But there's an interesting thing here in terms of their character, their institutional character, and their responses. Coke always, whenever met with a challenge and uncertainty, looks inward. Pepsi, whenever met with a challenge, whenever looking to be competitive, whenever wanting to move forward, always looks outward. Let me give you an example. Take a look at, just think of it for a second. Now, whenever you see a Pepsi ad,
it's on trend.
It's on trend. They spend more time trying to figure out what is the most newest, current, what's happening, and they connect to it. And it's Lady Gaga, and it's Michael Jackson, and it's whatever is happening right now. Okay? Coke, and I'm showing the famous Mean Joe Green ad, where, for those of you who don't remember, the Pittsburgh Steeler, big, tough, Mean Joe Green, big, gentle giant, comes walking out of a game, and a little boy is standing there, and he looks up and he says, he says, "Mr. Green?" And he looks at him and says, "What?" Because he's had a rough game. And the kid has his hand up and hands him a Coke. And he drinks that Coke. Coke, from the day one, has used as their positioning the connection to people. I'd love to teach the world to sing. You saw the Mad Men show, where the guy was going through an entire challenge of who he was. What does he do? They harken back to the famous Coca-Cola ad. Coke is different than Pepsi. So where Pepsi has always been about market share, increased market share. That's why they bought, for a number of years, they went and bought a chain of restaurants. They had Pizza Hut. They had Kentucky Fried Chicken. They were getting market share. Coke has the opposite approach. Coke's strategy has been, we want share of liquid within our users, within our customers, within our cohort. So instead, we'll use as our guide the individual, okay? The Mean Joe Green. If we can get him to drink a Coke and a Dasani and Minute Maid and Gatorade, I'll have what percentage of the man's liquid in him.
Right.
It's a different approach. But if you think about it, that's where their corporate character, that goes all the way back, that was expressed through their brand, that then gets implied in its strategy, has differentiated them, and it becomes reflective.
So just to make this really clear, so what Coca-Cola does is, when they do make acquisitions, they buy other firms or
share
companies
of body,
that will
share of liquid,
hydration, right?
They're
not buying fast food.
Share of liquid.
Right? And
so look at your organization's character as you respond. Some of them may already be there and be reflexive. You just don't even know it. Look at it. See if you can identify it. Let me give you a couple really interesting examples out there. USAA. For those of you who either are have served, you are a family member served, you may be insured by USAA. An amazing company. Grew out of a small group of Army airmen in the 1920s who couldn't get insurance. So they formed a mutual association and insured each other. So it was all about supporting each other. And then over the years, they've grown and grown and grown, adding other lines of service, opening the eligibility to now anyone who served honorably, whose family members can be members of USAA. But look at what they've done. Their current, not only their CSR, they hire They hire veterans. They took on, in their home city of San Antonio, veterans' homelessness, and they ended it. They actually declared themselves a winner. They went back to their basic roots: service people helping service people. Okay? And they made it their good work. And they do it because it's so important. Yes, it's in latent self-interest for the community, but most importantly, they're empowered to do it by their character. And that character has served them well. They're one of the best places to work. They provide an unbelievable service to their members. When they make a strategic decision, how about this? They were the first to offer the ability to deposit your check with your smartphone. Now, think about that. Every bank in the world was told you can't do that because it'll cause fraud. People will go put their check in and then they'll put it on their phone. You know what? It was the right thing for their members because they're in the military and they're
deployed around the world. Yep.
So,
and they trusted the character
of their
customers. Right. So this actually, let's just jump in and invite others into the conversation. So my friend Steven out in Oakland is asking, does character equal brand? Is that what we're ultimately talking about here? And I think I know the answer, but I want to hear what you're going to say.
Well, no, what did Abraham Lincoln say? It's
the tree.
It's the tree.
The tree, it's not the shadow. So let's just make that distinction really explicit for people here in present terms.
Now, USAA's brand is, we know what it means to serve. That's a shadow of their character. Their character was derived from their founding. Take a good look at your founding story. Understand it. That's where your character came from. And by the way, we're going to talk about this later. Character doesn't always mean good. Okay? Sometimes, and we're going to talk about this, there's a need to repent and reform. USAA has changed a lot over the years. They excluded servicemen. They were only officers for many, many years. They debated it. They talked about it. Debate was good. They said, we need to open the eligibility. There were a lot of officers who said, wait a minute, you do that, you're going to increase the risk. When you increase the risk, our rates are going to go up. We don't want to do it. But they knew the right thing to do. So character doesn't mean that you don't have to change. Character doesn't mean that it's always right. Character sometimes needs to change and evolve too. But there's a basic character in this company which has kept them around and will keep them around, I think, for a long time. Let me give you another example. And again, this is going to be strikingly, perhaps surprising to some people. BlackRock, largest asset manager in the world. They do the investment management for most major pension funds. Teachers, firemen, people like that. They also do governments. Mm-hmm. All right? They advise governments. They were the good guys. They came in during the 2007-2008 crisis and really helped appraise and work out a lot of bad assets. So they have their basic. They came out of a period in the 1980s when their leadership felt that the sell side, the people who were selling these products, had a lot more knowledge than the buy side. So they said, we're going to give the buy side, we're going to give the pension funds, right. We're going to give them the exact same tools to level the playing field. So from day one, their corporate character was always the customer needs to have the knowledge and transparency to make good decisions, or else they're always going to be disadvantaged. And from day one, that was their thing. They have now taken on retirement and preparation for retirement as a major, major issue. Now, of course, it's in latent self-interest. They sell retirement products, annuities. Mm-hmm. But the point being is, if I'm a young person, I want to join a company that's doing good. And their default has been to their basic core, which is to do what's right for the people who they serve.
Transparency.
Transparency, exactly. Now, you mentioned these next two, and to your point.
So here we're looking at, this is a piece that Grant Oliphant, and if you need to see it, it's on the network's Facebook page. You can find it obviously on the Heinz Endowment site as well. And my guess is you've seen this. This has gotten passed around quite a bit. Grant Oliphant wrote a piece about silence. He's a former chair of the network board. He had been very outspoken, or raised his voice in the days after the election, and he reflects here about having fallen silent, having been discouraged and dismayed, and offers a pretty resounding commitment to leading and offering up his institution's voice and leading on his principles and character as we go forward. Darren Walker has sent out a number of missives as well, and again, just to be clear, these are not folks who are alone. This is part of why we're talking to Bruce today, is that we've seen this trend. There are literally now dozens upon dozens of leaders of foundations and nonprofits, big and small, that have stepped forward and if nothing else, reaffirmed the values of their institution and reaffirmed their mission for their constituencies, who in some cases may be feeling a deep sense of anxiety. Will the Ford Foundation be there tomorrow? Will World Wildlife Fund or New America continue to exist and function the way we know and expect 6 months from now? And you can't undersell, I think, how important that is. And you can't, by the way, do that without being thoughtful and strategic and smart and really considering this as you do it. Because once you do it, you're owning it.
And what I really like about grants, and I encourage you all to read it, is it's not a simplistic notion. He really deals with not only the character of their organization, why they need, but he deals with his founders. Mm-hmm. He deals with his founders. He talks about Moynihan. Mm-hmm. He really does a great job in weaving the kind of the DNA. That it's not just a tree. Let me tell you about the leaves on this tree, and that's what I like so much about his. Darren's, first of all, Darren's a Southerner, and Southerners by their very nature, of course, I'm completely stereotyping, but boy, they always gravitate right toward character. He opens his line with, he says, "In moments of uncertainty, we often return to familiar touchstones." Hello, there he goes, and he follows. He quotes this wonderful Langston Hughes quote, and then he brings it back to what his organization will continue to be. And it is, now again, the Ford Foundation. You got Henry Ford. Yes, there was a man who had, in some cases, flawed character. But the institution itself has a character that Darren today has drawn a line in the sand and says, this is who we will be. And I think he's empowered by the past in that case. Great piece.
All right, and here's where we move to the practical of the last 12, 13 minutes that we have left here. All right, guys, get out your pencils, and we are recording this so you can come back to it later. But any guidance or best practices for folks who are with us today that you could share as they leverage their organization's character?
Yep. We talked about this, and the one that's been most recent is, I think, has been the LL Bean incident.
And let's just put this in context for people. So Linda Bean,
right,
who is one of the many Bean family members, she's one of 20 folks, I think, who serves on the board,
right,
and has a lobster roll shack outside the LL Bean headquarters in Freeport, Maine. I know this because I was just there. She was a pretty outspoken Donald Trump supporter. And what happens?
So, of course, people want to boycott LL Bean.
Because of her support for the president-elect.
And LL Bean immediately pivots, and you'd have to read it to see how beautifully articulated it is. But talk about shovel-ready. They pivot to their founder's vision and said, look, of course we're a big family. We're going to have a diversity of issues and beliefs. But we as an organization, we as an institution, have a set of beliefs that are extended from Leon Wood Bean, LL Bean, and it's a belief and a respect for our customers, for our employees, for our communities. Okay, that's it. Full stop. This is what we believe. It was quick. It was unequivocal. It wasn't political. It was who they are. We mentioned just today here in Washington, D.C., Nando's Peri Peri.
This is a
chain of Peri Peri chicken. Peri Peri is a kind of a Portuguese-inspired chicken that came out of South Africa. They're running a campaign, a Twitter campaign, a poster campaign for all the visitors here. And guys, help me. It is, we're all welcome. Is that what it's called?
Everyone's welcome.
Everyone's welcome. Hashtag everyone's welcome. It's intriguing because what they said was, one, we grew up in South Africa. We know what it's like to be excluded. We lived through it. Our roots are there. Everyone is welcome here. But there's a practical matter. Many of their employees are immigrants. Many of their employees are being paid minimum wage. Everyone's welcome means something internally to their people. Everyone's welcome means something externally to their visitors to Washington, D.C. And everything's welcome means something to them at their basic core character. We grew up in an era when welcome. These are examples where the core character, being so clear, being so well articulated, being so ready, creates an opportunity for these organizations to connect with all their constituencies.
And it cuts through the clutter. Right? Offers clarity, offers strategic clarity.
Correct. So
let's talk about it.
Here's a checklist for what I refer to as embracing character. Know who you are.
And how do you do that? I mean, I guess people spend.
Well, we'll talk about that on the next slide.
All right, fair enough.
Know who you are. But you've heard enough examples now that you might want to be, you might instinctively know it just by how you've been responding since you've been there, or take a look and talk to some of the people who've been there a while. They'll tell you who you are, but know who your roots are. Continually examine and re-examine. Don't just accept it. That's what's so interesting about what I think the best are doing right now. They just don't. It's just not empty. It's continually examined, re-examined,
and it's not implicit.
No,
it is explicit.
Explicit. Weigh the consequences of any decisions you make vis-a-vis your character and culture. I mean, this is what an organization like USAA does all the time. This is what an organization like BlackRock, the best do that. Encourage debate. If need be, as I mentioned before, repent and reform. Be straightforward. Yes, we've had to change. And with that, be confident and courageous. I used a quote that just came, I think, this week in response to it's time to end the Trump myopia. Okay? And it talks about this issue. You need to be prepared to react quickly. This is the key, I think, right now. And we talked about this thing. Okay? Lack of historical perspective because of the shortness of time. But the requirement for historical perspective to be able to respond quickly. There's a kind of a neat little irony there, is there not?
Absolutely.
So have it ready. Be aware, be ready. And then I put together, Sean, what I call my checklist for shovel-ready character in action. Okay? I want to take a quick look at that. So here's what you need to have. Do an assessment of the character strengths and vulnerabilities. It's a kind of classic, draw a line, write down on the left hand, character strengths. We talked about it when you and I talked the other day. We're a convening organization. On the other side, we tend to think of technology sometimes as a convener, and maybe it should be face-to-face. That's you are going through the assessment of your organization's character, strengths, and vulnerabilities. Okay? Have a clear and concise narrative of your founding character. I mean, that's what Ella Bean had. It could be a simple statement of what I just told you what USAA's is. We had these individuals. They couldn't get insurance. They came together and insured each other so that they could. That's a clear, concise statement of their founding character. Mutually respectful and helpful to each other. Come up with like 5 examples. And I said from your inventory of experience. Think of your history like an inventory.
Get away, times when we did X or
get away
Y.
from history, because then you're going to say, oh, it's history. It's an inventory. Go to your inventory, get 5 examples. That's all I want you to get, 5 examples of character in action. I told you, when USAA had to open up the eligibility, felt it was time to open up the eligibility to enlisted men instead of just officers. That was an example of character in action, and they have a number of those. BlackRock has a number of those. I would argue, get some good quotations from your founders, key personalities that articulate. We've gone through this thing, and whenever I've tried to demonstrate character, I've shown you a quote. It's great. It'll end up on someone's Pinterest page. It'll end up being re-quoted, if you're lucky. get the quotes ready. This is part of being shovel ready. And then please, get some images. So when you say, when we did this, so you can illustrate it. Make sure they're ready to go and off the shelf. That's my checklist of character in action.
And so let's think about this, because I think a lot of people are going to, and my first instinct when we were chatting before is, well, this is crisis communications, but it's not. It's a more proactive approach. So just to help people distinguish.
Yes, I'm not going to say it's good character hygiene. Let's move away from crisis communications and move toward hygiene, and then let's move it toward kind of habit, and then let's just make it who you are. Okay? So yes, this is not just for those times, because we had in the promotion of this thing that David Brooks quote, and he talked about people of character will always come back to this and always have the confidence. So it isn't a one and done, to your point. Crisis communications, great, done, move on.
It's a piece, and crisis communications can be folded into
Of course it could be, yeah, obviously.
But when you leave this conversation, folks hang up in the next few minutes, what should they go back to their desks and do? Or if they go talk to their boss next, what's the message you would want them to bring?
Well, just this. Right now, this is the time.
At this moment.
When this is, and it's interesting because we're going to show this next slide, because to me it's the most persuasive kind of single illustration of in the last week, where for the first time I said, "Oh my goodness!" And
should we show?
Yeah.
Reveal it? I feel like we're teasing people.
Yeah. So, and here's what happened. One of the ladies in my office.
Well, let's just tell everybody, for folks who, and I don't know how you would have missed this, but if you did, President Obama offered the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor that you can receive, to Vice President Joe Biden. He had invited him into an Easter egg ceremony that was meant to honor his service. Biden had no idea that he was going to earn this. And what's more, President Obama did something that I think only 3 or 4 other individuals have ever received. It was the Presidential Medal of Freedom with distinction. Biden is, as you can see in the photograph, was brought to tears. This is a man who's been through a lot over the last couple of years, and he is just completely awed and stoic and moved by this moment.
What was interesting about it, and why this even struck me more, is a woman in my office takes the MARC train down in the morning.
MARC train is a commuter train in Washington.
And for those of you who know Biden, he used to go back and forth on Amtrak because he wanted to be home at night with his kids. He lost his wife, a tragic accident, and a daughter, and he wanted to be home every night. So when he was in the Senate, he would take the train back and forth every day. And by the way, I used to take the train in New York, and you would see porters, you would see guys working in the cafe car, and they all knew him and they loved him, the man. All right. The other day, one of my people was coming down the MARC train. She said that everyone was stopped, and this is a busy morning in the Union Station, and security's holding everyone back. Everyone wants to get to work, holding everyone back. So you would think you'd be irritated, but who was coming through with Joe Biden? And she said the place erupted in applause. Yeah. And then this happened like a day later, and I watched this and I said, this is character. So if I had to go to someone in my office right now and convince them as to how character can really stand out in the midst of, I would just show them that picture and tell them, if they don't know the story, because something as simple as that can be as powerful as that. And so I think you all have something extremely powerful that you already own, that is proven over time to work. I mean, why wouldn't you use it? To me, it's a slam dunk. And then go to the checklist and go to work.
All right. And I want to just, if we can, we'll linger here on the picture of Biden, but I want to take Matt's question. Is the main takeaway of this topic setting aside the views of a CEO or board to make sure that character, that tree, the mission, the values of the organization is reflected in its shadow? Is leadership unable to set aside their personal opinions? Should they be replaced? Or if leadership, should they be replaced?
That's, I can't advise you on that, but you certainly have put your finger on an issue that is a problem. The greatest leaders are those who it isn't about their personal opinion. It is about, it's Churchill and Lincoln and Harriet Tubman, okay? And so I would argue I don't know if they should be removed or not. I think that time will remove them. Certainly, you know, as you know, those who are of character are over time are the ones who are treated the best. You know, Churchill said, "History will be kind to me because I intend to write it." And so if your leadership is not writing history, is not part of the character of your organization, I think that is a problem.
And the organizations we're talking about here are foundations and nonprofits, right? They are in the business of doing good.
Yes.
That is their aim and purpose.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting is the leadership that we're seeing in the examples we showed are pivoting toward their character and that was there long before them. These are Ford Foundation's a 100-year-old organization. So we're going back. It isn't Darren's. He is pivoting to the character of the organization.
And with that, I think we have to leave it there. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Before you go, I think Tristan's going to send everybody a survey, but also I think, Bruce, you wanted to do a very nice, kind thing here and offer people the book. Is
okay.
That right?
Yeah, I've got a, yeah.
Did I just put you on the spot?
No. My staff was after me for years to write a book, and I resisted, and I finally did it. It's called Start with the Future and Work Back, and there's a lot of just practical case studies of how organizations do this. It might help you as you think about how you might want to do this. Here's what I'd like you to do. Either you've got my email. Just send me an email with your name and an address, any comments you might have, and then put in the subject line, comment.
Send me a book or whatever.
Yeah, send me a book, whatever, and we'd be glad to send you a book. And I'd be interested in your comments on that.
And we can find you on Twitter, and I'm going to put you on the spot. You were with us at ComNet in Detroit. Will you be with us in Miami? So
I already asked you.
Oh, that's right. Okay. So you're already coming, folks. So you're going to see him down in Miami soon. If you haven't signed up, please do. We're actually starting to run short on seats, remarkably. Thanks, everybody, for being with us. I hope this was helpful. I don't think that we've closed this conversation. I hope what we've done is started to help you think through, if you're not already, and I suspect many of you are, thinking about how to leverage character as a strategic asset, and to really think about it as that North Star that's guiding all the work you're doing. And in the moments ahead when there may be some turbulent times, it offers a path forward that's quite clear and uncluttered. And in that, I think it's a really powerful idea. And Bruce, thank you so much for giving us some really good ideas about how to distill that down and make it really simple and a guiding principle to lead your organizations forward. So thank you very, very much. Anything we haven't touched about that we ought to mention to everybody before we go?
No. Keep making history.
I'll just leave with this lovely picture of this is not today in Washington, D.C., but
feels that way.
It does feel that way, and certainly if that was traffic, that would be an accurate picture. All right, guys, thanks so much. Be well. We will be back soon. As a matter of fact, in February, we are going to have Bradford Fitch. He's the CEO of the Congressional Management Foundation. We'll have details on this soon, but they've done a fascinating thing. The purpose of CMF, the Congressional Management Foundation, is actually to help all 535 congressional offices, Senate and House offices, work better, work more efficiently, right? Really cool thing. But because of that, they have just developed tremendous goodwill across the aisles. They're a nonpartisan organization, and what they did last year, and I don't want to give up too much of the goose, is they've done some really interesting research. You guys have probably seen on your Facebook pages and elsewhere how to be an effective advocate in Congress, and many folks who are congressional staffers or former congressional staffers have put some information up. But what CMF did was surveyed all 535 members of Congress. Then they went out and did some trainings for advocates, sent them up onto Capitol Hill, and then evaluated what worked and what didn't work. And they have a big report that's going to reveal what actually worked. And Brad's going to tell us all about what they found and how that might have a bearing on the work that you do. Because, of course, at the end of the day, if you work at a foundation or a nonprofit, you're in the ideas business. And a lot of ideas that we hold near and dear are going to be subject to some significant debate and, in some cases, some significant change in the days and weeks ahead.
Be true to thyself.
Be true to thyself. All right. Thanks, everybody.